Hello everyone and welcome to this week's edition of Titled Tuesday. My name is Rebecca or #Chess and I'm going to be your host for this evening. You also possibly heard the dog barking just as I unmuted. Perfect timing. But welcome. We have an amazing lineup this week. We should have some very, very exciting chess. You can see on the screen that Hikaru is headlining today's event as the top seed, but some very, very tough competition. So we will see how he holds up and whether he is able to get yet another Titled Tuesday victory. He is our defending champion as well because last week was won by Hikaru. You can see though we have Grischuk busy playing as well, Jeffrey Zhang, V Pranav, some really, really strong names there. So we are really excited to see how this ends up going. Just a reminder, if you haven't seen Titled Tuesday before, this is the way that it works. So it is an 11-round Swiss tournament. It's obviously 4 titled players, and it happens every single Tuesday, same time, same place. And the time control for the event is 3 minutes per side with 1 second added per move, which leads to some crazy time scrambles as we see every week. We do have some great prizes up for grabs every week as well, with $750 going to the first place, as well as prizes reserved for the best placed streamer and the best female player in the event. The games are going to kick off in about 10 seconds, so we're going to see how this will go. Let me know in the chat who you think is going to win this week's event. Who are you rooting for? I see some familiar names as well. We have Eric Hansen. You can't see it on the screen over there, but if we scroll a bit, he's playing as well. We have Jasper, another streamer. Fair Chess on YouTube. We've seen him play some great chess in previous weeks. Mykola, Bortnik as well. Emma Terrible. So many strong names, and it looks as though the games are also underway. So we should be able to see fairly soon. Some of these players I haven't seen in Titled Tuesday in a couple of weeks, so I'm excited to see what they're able to do today. We can start off, I've clicked on Hikaru's game, but actually I think we're going to start off by looking at board number 2. It is Grischuk versus a streamer, Dina Belenkai. I think she's hosted quite a few Titled Tuesday events as well. And let's just go back and see how this game started off and follow. It is a massive imbalance in terms of ratings. And if you haven't seen a Swiss event before, this is usually how it works. The first couple of rounds are quite tricky for the lower rated players because they paired against the top seeds. But as we are closer and closer towards the final round, we have the top scorers, which are usually the highest rated players, playing against each other. So we started off e4, c6, Grischuk playing the Caro-Kann. I love to see it. And Dina going for a fairly solid setup, just getting her pieces out, getting her king to safety. And it looks as though nothing too spectacular out of the opening, but let's see if they've managed to get some fireworks. We're seeing that knight just maneuvering back to f1 to jump to a slightly more active square and not playing anything too crazy, which is, it's always a decision to make when you're playing against someone who's much higher rated than you. Do you try and go for crazy complications that hopefully your higher rated opponent miscalculates and you end up getting a 1 position? Or do you just go for quiet, simple chess and see how it goes and see if you manage to hold them to a draw or possibly even they mess up the end game? We haven't seen Magnus playing a Titled Tuesday in quite a while. I think for a lot of the players, they have a very busy schedule, and so they can't play every week, but it's really great to have the opportunity to see some high-level chess every single Tuesday for the comfort of your own homes. And it's also exciting chess because this is 3-1. You guys have had a lot of classical chess for the past couple of weeks, watching the Grand Swiss, and then there was the Blitz the other day as well. But the Blitz I always find a little bit more exciting because you can see an entire game in 10 minutes, which is absolutely great. You don't have to really think super hard in order to try and figure out what's going on when they are taking 20-30 minutes to make a single move sometimes. Grischuk is quite an opponent to kick things off with, yes. Maybe not the first round matchup that Dina was expecting, but such a great opportunity to play against such strong opponents and just the opportunities for an upset as well. I remember last time I was commentating, it was a couple of weeks ago, and we started off by seeing a massive upset in round 1, where I think it was our second seed as well, busy losing to someone 400 rating points lower. So we are rooting for Dina over here to see if she manages to pull this off. And she's hopping the knight to f5. If black takes, you're then busy giving up your bishop for the knight. But this might be something that you would consider just based on the fact that the knight could be a little bit problematic over here if Dina does then launch a kingside attack. She's also adding some pressure to the bishop, which is why presumably there was a decision to take over here. And now I would assume you have to take back. You can't go takes over here because after rook captures back, we just have rook takes. Oh, okay, maybe you can do this. So maybe Dina can decide, is she going to trade both pairs of rooks, or is she just going to maybe hang on to one pair of rooks? The general rule with this is that if you are attacking and you're getting to more of an endgame situation, it's usually a good idea if you're attacking to trade off one pair of rooks to try and limit your opponent's counterplay, but hang on to the other rook because it could help with an advantage. Not that we're quite in an endgame yet over here. The queens are both still on the board. We have a lot of play left in this position. We're only on move 22 so far. And surprisingly, look at that time difference. Although I think Grischuk is always notoriously in time trouble all the time, so living up to his name. But that could play a massive factor in this game because, I mean, 1 second increment, it's very hard to gain time on the clock. So you essentially then don't have any time to think. You just have enough time to blitz out your moves, but not to calculate if you're still in a complicated situation. All right, so offering the rook trade again. Will she go for the double rook trade? I missed a move over there. H takes g3 was played so quickly, I didn't even notice. And now Grischuk has a knight in f4. The knights are very, very frustrating when they are on f4 and f5 because they're controlling some really key squares on the board. And this is why both players are opting to put their knights there. And now Dina has to decide either you trade rooks or you have to give up control of the d file unless you can maybe drop your queen back to d1. I'm not sure if this is something that we might like to consider. If we can take a sneaky look at an engine evaluation, and it is Grischuk who currently has the advantage in this situation, I would assume, because White's bishop is not, well, neither bishop is very active, for being completely honest. This one, though, is hemmed in by its own pawns, and this knight is maybe causing a couple more problems than its counterpart on f5. But I mean, the time is becoming more and more of a factor. We're down to 30 seconds on the clock for Grischuk, which could be a little bit stressful. And he's still thinking. Dina pre-moving moves over there. And after 21 seconds, Grischuk opts for the very quiet-looking queen to c7. Queen to c7, I'm guessing it might be trying to just make sure there are no problems with the knight hopping in over here. Because then you might have to even look out for some side rank mate problems if the king goes over here and the knight's busy cutting off those escape squares. Possibly as well, there's the plan for b5. The queen is also just hanging on to that a pawn, which is important to look at as well. And Dina's now using a lot of time, so the time is almost equal. We're going to get into a massive time scramble in this game. I'm predicting it now. Knight is being attacked. You don't really want to head to this square over here. None of my arrows are making sense. There we go. You don't want to head to this square over here. I would be worried about that because there might be the potential for a pin along the d file. But I suppose you do. You have this defense. The knight is busy undermining it a little bit. And yeah, b6 as well. You obviously can't take the pawn. I won't make the move just because we don't want to miss the moves that will be made now. You can't take the pawn because then the queen wins the entire knight. Knight's hopping back, which means you are losing a pawn, unfortunately, and that could be when you're playing against a 3000 rated player. Unfortunately, a pawn can just mean it's game over, which is really tough. All right, the queen's going back, still defending. I mean, the knight's also so tricky to play against in time trouble. I'm sure every single one of us who's played some blitz or bullet chess online have fallen to a knight fork in time trouble. You just always have to be aware that knights jump, and it's not necessarily the quickest pattern to see. We saw in the speed chess champs match, Giri versus Duda, we saw a couple of forks and missed there as well. So grandmasters do it too. You need to be very careful, and it's now 2 seconds versus 6 seconds. I don't think we're going to get an upset over here, but a hard-fought battle. Nevertheless, we can watch out the last couple of moves, but you're dropping too many pawns, and black now has these two connected pass pawns, and absolutely nothing really stopping them on their way to victory. This knight as well, just notice that it is doing a great defensive job, but now that the bishop has been traded, it is game over. But a really tough fight there from Dina. Grischuk, I mean, getting into almost time trouble. I mean, 30 seconds on the clock versus over a minute, but still managing to get the win. We expect nothing less, I guess. Let us try and see which games are still underway. Is this game? Okay, that game is over. and we're getting some suggestions for lessons. It always takes a little bit of time to update. Okay, we still have Eric Hansen's game versus Euro 58. Was underway, but Eric has just managed to get the win. Once again, a massive rating difference, 29.54 to 24.75. And I think that was a checkmate. What a nice checkmate. You can see over here that the queen is defended by the knight, and it is covering all of these escape squares, and your king, strangely enough, is covering the b5 square, so there's no escape for white's king. Very nice win over there. I'm glad we managed to catch the end of that game. And now we can check in. We have an FM versus a GM, slightly different rating, so 2700 GM, which is still very, very impressive. And we've got a same color bishop endgame, and 2 pawns for each side. One of those pawns is dropped though, and unfortunately, it is a draw. They know their theory. So the key thing, we see this every week in Titled Tuesday, it seems. The key thing is that if it is a rook pawn, so a pawn on the side of the board, either the H file or the A file, you need to, in order to win, you need to have your bishop the same color as the promotion square. So in this case, we need to have a dark squared bishop, because else you just can't chase the king away from this. And okay, they're just going back and back, repeating moves. To defend this position, all you need to do is you just keep your king on these 2 squares. Because if you go over here, let's just pause. I mean, this game will be a draw, so we're not missing too much action. I don't know if I'll be able to move a piece though. I won't. They're moving too fast. The problem is that if you try and get your bishop in the game, okay, we can rewind. They were just playing too fast for us, but a draw as expected. There were no flagging chances over there with the 1 second increment. So if you, where was I trying to? I think we were looking around about, yeah, well, this is one way to get a draw in terms of if you try to promote the pawn's then cutting off the square that your king can escape to. And the other problem is if you try to get your bishop into the game at all, let's say you move your bishop over here, then once again we get ourselves a stalemate because the king can't go across. And because it's the wrong color bishop, you just can't chase that king away from the corner, unfortunately. So even if you're an entire bishop and a pawn up, it is still a draw. And that is why chess is sometimes a very cruel game, but we love it nonetheless. And it looks as though our second round has kicked off. I'm just checking the standings have updated, so that is great. Let's start off. We can go and have a look at Jeffrey's game. So Jeffrey is playing now against a candidate master with a 2600 rating, and we saw some really good chess from Jeffrey last time. We were busy. I was commentating Untitled Tuesday, and he really pulls off some insane victories. Even when he gets himself into time trouble, he can play very, very fast. So I mean, he's already 30 seconds down on the clock. Let's just rewind so we can see how the game started out. We started off just with a French defense. I mean, I preferred Grischuk c6, but we all have our preferences. And okay, it started off looking as though it was going to be a win hour. I think the win hour is usually when you have your bishop on d2, but we got a queen on f3. Wouldn't usually be recommended. I'm not entirely sure what the plan is over there. Usually when you see that in an 1100 level, that's the threat is f7. But maybe here it's just white has decided that he would like to play an attacking game and is placing the queen so that it's ready to attack. Of course, the drawback, remember, with bringing your queen out too early is that it can be attacked by your opponent's pieces, and no matter what attacks it, if it's a pawn, a bishop, a knight, probably not a rook, but even a rook, you then have to move it. You can't just offer exchange or leave it where it is. Okay, and there we go, white committing to the attack with g4. Problem is, I was about to say, black hasn't castled yet, and black can just choose to castle on the same side, but we still got a bit of an attack on the king side. Remember, king side over here is the side of the board. It's always confusing when the kings have castled and gone to the opposite side. And then we have a couple of exchanges of pieces, and this is the current position on the board. So fairly equal in terms of time. Jeffrey's played the last couple of moves a bit faster than his opponent, and we have to be a little bit careful here in terms of its opposite colored bishops, which, as we saw in the previous game, or was the previous game same colored bishops? I cannot remember. I have a very short-term memory loss. But opposite colored bishops do often lead to drawish positions. When you have opposite colors in the middle game, though, that can be quite an advantage, because the key thing is your bishop can attack squares that your opponent can't defend. And I think here, with the rook lift to d3, it looks as though white is the one who is trying to go for an attack. I'm expecting maybe like rook c3 might be something that will be played fairly soon, going after the c7 pawn, and so black is obviously just defending that as well, and also getting the rook off of the back rank. I don't think it makes sense at this stage to double up rooks on this file because it's very much closed with the pawns on the file, but I mean, having a rook on the second rank is useful for defense, especially with white having quite a bit of activity over here. Right, so we've had the knights traded off. We're moving closer and closer to an opposite colored bishop endgame, especially with white offering the queen for a trade. Jeffrey decides to just pick up that pawn again. Remember, there was a trade earlier, or not really a trade. Black just dropped a pawn, but it wasn't really a loss of a pawn because it was easy to just recapture it at some stage. Okay, so white is really trying to force this exchange of queens. So it takes over here. I'm guessing you take back with the pawn in order to just solidify your structure and make sure that things are all safe over there and your H pawn is supported. Taking with the bishop maybe looks a little bit more awkward, but we'll see. We get the opportunity to see if this is happening. Jeffrey taking the queen after quite a think, and there we go, taking back with the pawn. Pawn structure is incredibly important when it does come to endgames. If you have, we call them pawn islands. Basically, if there's a space between your pawns over here, if you took back with the bishop, then you'd have 3 pawn islands as white. So this would be a pawn island because it's just a pawn chilling by itself. This would be a pawn island. There's nothing on either side of it. And then these 4 pawns on the side of the board would be another island. And ideally, you want to have as few islands as possible because when your pawns are isolated or far apart and they're just alone on an island, they unfortunately don't have anything to defend them. So that's why you want to take back, because now these 2 pawns can defend each other and possibly advance together. So we've had another couple of moves. We can just speed on to see where we've ended up. Putting a pawn on c3 just to protect this d4 pawn. And this is where we're starting to see the problem sometimes with opposite colored bishops, in that, I mean, all of these pawns can never be attacked by the light squared bishop unless they move. And the pawns can also possibly be blocking us a little bit, unfortunately. All right, but our Wai Moi opts to go for a b4, which is a little bit of a strange looking move. And Jeffrey decides not to take, because ideally if a pawn takes, you want to take back and then take with your king, and your king will then become a lot more active. I've just highlighted a square. Let's get rid of this. Okay, and carrying on advancing the pawns. Unfortunately here as well, you can't really do anything. This bishop is just completely blocking your rook out of action. And this is the only other open file on the board where we have our rook on f1. And hard to see how you can get this in the game. The f5 square is very much covered. You can go to f4, but I mean, are you really wanting to go to g4? Doesn't look like a really great square to go to. Perhaps it is. We'll see what happens. And yeah, no other places that you can make use of this open file. So white is starting to just repeat moves, and now the pressure is on for Jeffrey to try and come up with some sort of plan, create some sort of imbalance in order to try and get the win. You don't necessarily want to end up just losing half a point in round 2 of the tournament, but it's starting to look as though that might be the case. Once again, you have no pawns in order to dislodge this bishop, so that makes things tricky as well. Black maybe has this in future, but I don't think it's something that you definitely can't play it right now, because it will just give too much activity. If we were to push the pawn, can take, and bishop takes, and then suddenly this f file can be used by white's rooks. So you do not want to do that. All right, the bishop finally moves from its post on e4, where it was just holding everything together, moves to d3, and now there we go, the offer of a rook trade. Blocking up the file once again, because black's rook, you don't want it to get here if you move your rook off of this rank. All right, going across. What do you do? I think this is oh my goodness. Look at that tactic. You can never sit back and relax. The idea here being king takes, rook takes, and suddenly look how active black's rook is. They can maybe get around, maybe down here and just take this pawn. Let's just see what's happening in the game so we don't miss anything. And it seems like that actually happened. So black's rook definitely looking a little bit more active now. Still defendable, I would guess. Okay, it's dead drawn according to the engine. But the players are still fighting. Definitely. It's down to 6 seconds for Wai Moi. It is 18 seconds for Jeffrey. which is quite tough. You need to still be on the lookout for tactics. You don't want to get mated in a position like this, which sometimes happens, crazily enough. And that is a very good result for Wymoy. Unfortunately, not that great for Jeffrey. But I mean, a tough game from both players, and really difficult to see how either of them was supposed to make any progress in that. All right, we're going to... Oh, let's actually jump over to this game if it's still going on. Oh, it's not going on, unfortunately. But I saw Goryachkina was busy playing against V Pranav. Apparently, V Pranav has just made International Master. Last week, he got his title. And Goryachkina, she was playing in the open section of the Grand Swiss event. I'm not entirely sure. It says white one over here. So V Pranav getting the win. But we will hopefully see Alexandra busy clawing her way back into the top tables. Let's try and see what other games are still going on. Okay, we still have one of the top boards games going on. It is Fair Chess on YouTube, which I think is on Draken, if I'm remembering correctly, versus a lot of well-playeds 2015. And it looks once again opposite colored bishop endgame. It is really tough, but the time was even tougher and black ended up getting the win. So this is once again a difficulty playing against a high-rated opponent. Often they are able to just play a little bit faster, and you have to be so careful you're not making mistakes that you end up flagging in your game. And here we have obviously a very imbalanced position with the queen versus queen, but I expect this should be a draw. Going there we go. Okay, I assumed the entire point of busy going king to king to a5 was that so after queen a3 you could plop your queen on a4 and then end up just getting a draw because the queens had to be traded because they were pinned. Apparently that was not the case. So white is... That was painful to see. That was very, very painful to see. This is the kind of thing that makes us want to quit chess. So as I was saying earlier, I mean, fortunately, there's a lot of time to untilt after this game, and there are 2 more rounds. 2 more rounds before the break, so not too much longer to survive until then. But as I was saying earlier, so I thought, I mean, this is dead drawn. It's queen versus queen. I'm not entirely sure why white played on and was putting the king back here. I would assume if you didn't go for the immediate draw, you might try and go for like a checkmate, given that black's king is on the side of the board, but that didn't seem to be the plan. The idea with this, of course, is that the queen can't move out of the way. If you try to do it, it just doesn't work because the queen is pinned to the king. So I thought that was the quick draw that they were going for. But it happens to all of us, unfortunately. It's so easy to miss the queen blunders. My chat knows that I do this very, very, very frequently. So we can move on to round 3, and good luck to those players for the rest of the event. One of those players very, very happy, and one of those players probably quite frustrated with that result. I think we're going to start off by looking at Grischuk's game. So we're now playing against Ibel 95, 2700. So we saw first round it was like 2400 versus 3000. It's getting a little bit closer, but Grischuk still a clear favorite with an extra 300 rating points and a very early exchange over there. Some interesting, I don't know if this is opening theory at all. I'm not entirely sure. But both of the players developing their pieces, so it's looking fairly standard. And this is the position we're currently at after 13 moves. You know, we often have blind spots when it comes to, even with increment. I've blundered pieces in games where I have a lot of time left on my clock. Sometimes you're just so in the zone and so focused on moving fast as well. Maybe you're pre-moving, and the 1 second increment is not that much time. So possibly it did happen that it was either tunnel vision or a pre-move gone wrong, and that's what happened to the queen. It does unfortunately happen. It is tough, but it's what we accept when we do play speed chess. It is all part of the great experience. Okay, so in this game we do have that white has the bishop pair, but it's not the... This would be a difficult position to classify as like completely closed or open. I mean, all of the pawns are still quite far back. There hasn't been a lot of expansion from black in terms of the pawns, well, from black or for white. Quite a symmetrical pawn structure as well. I am noticing though that white has given up a pawn in order to have the bishop pair. I'm not sure if that was a blunder. I think the pawn on e4 dropped, and unfortunately it wasn't recovered. White, of course, always has, this is a sneaky, I mean, we've seen if a queen can be blended, checkmate, and one can also be blended by grandmasters. So it might happen. It might happen, although we expect Grischuk will be aware of all of the tricks. And we get ourselves, okay, another rook trade. So now it's the two bishops and a pawn down versus the knight and a bishop. And white is trying perhaps to go for some sort of attack, but I'm afraid I think you've run out of pieces over here. Generally, to attack, you need to have, first of all, more pieces than your opponent has defending. And we can see here that the knight, bishop, and queen are all kind of on the king side. So they're all doing some defense over there. And yeah, white is down to two bishops supporting the queen. And after a move like g6, unfortunately, you don't really have anything. I think it's too ambitious to go for something like h5, or black can actually just defend that. So it's not necessarily ambitious, but it's not going to lead to a quick knockout blow. And there we go. This is a move that's it's quite a good move to make. The first thing is it's just getting it off of this d file, because there was the threat that if the knight moved out of the way, the bishop was then being attacked. Especially something relevant to think about if you're not a grandmaster, because then it's easy to forget that your pieces are being attacked and to forget about pins like that. But so good strategy, just to make sure there are no tactics over there. And an additional bonus of this, by pushing g6, this diagonal is quite weak. So putting the bishop on this diagonal, and that's why black, of course, quickly went back to defend. It does set up chances if your opponent ignores it all in order to get a nice queen and bishop. Would you call it a battery? I'm not entirely sure, but a queen and bishop along this diagonal and just threaten checkmate. And it looks here as though white has gained back the pawn. So we're now playing bishop versus knight, and the queens are still on the board, which always makes it tricky. You have to still watch out for tactics, still watch out for mating threats, and another difficulty if you're trying to win this game and the queens are still on the board, then you have to watch out for things like perpetual check, which really does make life quite frustrating. And here, just one tactic that has to be kept an eye on is queen to d4 is attacking the knight and it's attacking the king. Okay, like obviously it doesn't work at this stage because the queen's defending the knight, so I thought they might hang off on that move just for a little bit, but white decided to go straight for that and now to start advancing the pawns. We'll see how this ends up going. All right, we've got a pawn on c5. Which is never really a move that you like to see, because you can't take it. Once again, we were talking earlier about pawn islands. So if you take over here, now look at your pawns. You've got a pawn here, you've got a pawn here. They can't protect each other in an endgame. And moving the queen away, then it's just opening up this file for the queen. You don't necessarily want that to happen. You don't want to give your opponent targets in an endgame that they can end up attacking. Yeah, and bishop versus knight endgames, they can be really tricky to play. I think there are books devoted to that entire topic. The usual thing, or the usual strategy, is so the bishop is good for when there are pawns on both sides of the board. And in this case, there are pawns on both sides of the board. So you can see there's a pawn on this side and then there are a bunch of pawns on this side as well. And the reason for that is the bishop can move really, really far. So a knight might take like 5 or 6 moves to get all the way across to attack the correct square on the other side of the board, whereas the bishop can easily switch between attacking on the left and the right hand side of the board. Where the knight is better though is it can switch colors. So your bishop is always stuck on the same color. Your knight is able to switch colors and maybe attack pawns that are in a different color. So that's where the knight can have an advantage. And obviously we mentioned earlier, it's particularly relevant in speed chess, but the knight, it's all of these tricky forks that you have to look out for. So the knight is obviously often an advantage with that. Over here though, it is looking fairly balanced, possibly even a little bit dangerous for black, in terms of white has these two pawns together and you can create a passed pawn at an opportune moment. You can sacrifice one of your pawns and then just run your pawn through to the other side. This is possibly looking a little bit tricky for Grischuk with 11 seconds left on his clock. But we have faith that his endgame knowledge is very good, else he probably wouldn't be a 3000 rated player and one of the top grandmasters in the world. So we'll see how he manages to cope with this. Bishop, of course, is now a little bit problematic because it can't switch colors. And the knight is now starting to look a little bit better, just based on the fact that now that the king's there, how do you make any progress with this pawn? I suspect the answer is you don't make any progress with the pawn. And now the king's being driven back. The king can get to this square, where it will then be attacking the c4 square. or you might even put your knight on the square at some stage in future. And now black has this passed pawn that white has to worry about, and black can start attacking. So I think we're getting a little bit of a masterclass in the endgame over here from Grischuk, and it's starting, the tables have definitely turned. It's starting to look a lot better for black because, okay, once again, you can't trade over here because this pawn is going to be too fast. The king's more active, and now they passed pawns on both sides of the board, and it should be game over very, very shortly. Yeah, we're going for the flag over there, but Grischuk has too much time and that 1 second increment, and just removing the pawn, taking away any chances. The only obstacle here, it is not over yet. There is always the stalemate obstacle, but I think it should be pretty easy. And there we go, resignation. As a lower rated player, it's generally advisable, and when I'm saying lower rated, I'm saying not a grandmaster or an international master. If you're about 1100, 1300, 1500, generally don't resign in these positions. There's always the opportunity for your opponent to make a mistake, but when you're playing against Grischuk, you can trust that he knows how to convert his advantage. Let's switch over to this game, which is happening. It is I Am Swiss Fighter, who's a 2700 versus Emma Terrible, a streamer from, is it Peru? It is. Okay, my knowledge of flags is not terrible. 2900. So once again, a fairly closely contested match. Black looking very, very good over here with the 2 pawns. But it's not over yet. We do have time. Oh my goodness, white has even more time trouble. I've just noticed that there's a second on the clock, which is not great. White had to give up the bishop, and it's looking as though we might have ourselves a little bit of an upset. Unfortunately, we had it earlier that you could be up a bishop and a pawn, but it can still be drawn. But here it's not a rook pawn, so it should be able to promote. And just as the cherry on top to make things easier, I mean, the promotion square for this pawn is the same color as the bishop. So it shouldn't be too difficult to convert, although white is still going to put up a fight, of course. Your opponent can still slip up. It's not over until the score is on the board. And we actually, as I was saying, there's the opportunity to blunder. I'm remembering the game earlier with the queen versus queen. So definitely the chance for blunders at this level. But this is really tough. A very nice, if you just notice over here why that was such a good move, is this is now forcing the rook trade, and you're defended by the bishop, because you're attacking the king and the rook at the same time, so you can't avoid it. And white's only chance here is to try and hang on to the rook, but here you just can't do it. So that's a knockout blow, and unfortunately the end of the game there for Emma Terrible. All right, this is the last game underway in round 3. Remember, we have our first break after round 4, and this is such a tricky endgame. I will admit I do not know how to win this. There's some sort of technique that I've just never learned, and it is queen versus rook, which is theoretically won. It is won, but it's not easy to convert. Some of you may have been wondering, why didn't they just take the free rook earlier? And the problem was the free rook led to stalemate. Oh, okay. This is apparently how we convert the position. Very nicely done over there from player 2006M. Another upset. Another upset, busy beating his higher rated opponent, 2866, a grandmaster. So that is a great result. Yeah, getting the king active, and then but at some stage I'll learn how this works. But it's one of those positions that I never get in my own game, so I feel my time is better spent studying other concepts. But in order to get to the level of grandmaster or international master or a 2600 FIDE master, it is these sort of things that do set you apart from the rest of the players. All right, let's who should we look at next? We can maybe carry on looking at Grischuk's game, or shall we look at board number 3, which is Alexander Zubov? Maybe we start off with his game and we can check in on Grischuk later. Just in terms of the standings, if we have a quick look at that, and it looks as though they have been updated. Yes, they are updated. Seems like they're not updated on my on my other side, because I'm still seeing old standings after round 1. But yes, it looks as though Hikaru is still undefeated on 3 out of 3. Quite a few players on 3 out of 3. I'm scrolling and scrolling. The top 20. Oh nope, it's longer than 27. Okay, it's the top 43 players are still on full score, which is quite a lot of players, which means we'll only get a clear idea of the front runners quite a few rounds into today's event. Let's just see how this game started out. So we have a d4, knight f6. Okay, fairly standard opening theory at this stage, excepting the pawn on c4. The idea often with giving this up is that you can often recapture with the bishop, and you get the pawn back with tempo because you get an extra move. So I'm not sure if this is theory. I'm an e4 player myself and not too clued up on. I also don't play this as black. But we trust that they know what they're doing, although sometimes grandmasters do play some strange or slightly dubious openings when they're playing blitz chess, because it is easier to get away with things compared to when you're playing a classical game. And over here we do have it's move 14, and they're fairly similar in terms of, okay, I suppose 20 seconds is quite a big difference, definitely. We'll see how this progresses. I see a question, how big is the field? We currently have 482 players who are in the field. There might have been a couple more who entered at the start. Some people drop out during the event. Some people join during the event. But it's quite a big field. And I think a lot of the top seeds are doing what is expected of them. So they're getting the wins. Whereas in previous weeks, sometimes we get quite a few draws from the higher rated players busy clawing their way back from an inferior position. We can try and see who we can look at in the next round. Generally, it's easiest to find the games for some of the top-rated players, just because they appear at the top of my list, but I'll see if I can see Tari on the next one. Alright, so black is getting the knight to a very nice square over there. It can't be attacked by any of white's pawns. It's what we call an outpost, just because white no longer has a c-pawn, so we can't get a pawn to c4, and the e-pawn is too far advanced to attack this knight over here. So I don't expect that we're going to get a knight take c3, although I'm worried every time I say that, because then often the grandmasters just do that, and fortunately here they didn't prove me wrong. The one thing that might come into play in future is this knight is a little bit out of it at the moment, but it can hop to b3 possibly if that's going to accomplish anything in future, where it'll be supported by the b4 pawn. Not a possibility right now though, because bishop takes c4 and you're just dropping a pawn and you have to retreat the knight, which would just not be a great thing. And the c-file would be opened. That would be a horrific move. So definitely knight b3 is something to avoid at the moment, but something to look at in future. And queen c6, a really sneaky move. I'm guessing the idea is partly to defend the c4 pawn, but then another thing, you can just imagine, this is actually a horrible way to get checkmated, which is realistic for quite a few of us. Knight takes, okay, let's say that just a random move was made over here. Knight takes c3, maybe taking back over here, and the game is over immediately with queen takes g2. So that's a threat to look out definitely for in future. Don't expect it to happen now. So this is what happened. The knight took over here just to try and close the d-file if pawn takes back like this. And black obviously opts then to take with the rook, so that you have the opportunity to keep that open. But all right, I thought that might have been a blunder initially, but everything seems to be held. Okay, it might be a blunder. It's fine. Okay, everything was held together. There were a lot of things going into this move. The first thing is that this is attacking this. This is also being attacked by the rook. There's just a lot of things being attacked. Fortunately, the queen's not overloaded though, because the knight is busy defending the bishop. So there isn't this would be problematic in terms of you're dropping the rook, but fortunately over there, everything was well defended, and even the pin was nothing to be worried about at all. Let's just skip back so we saw what happened after that. So rook takes, with the idea that if you take the free queen, it's never a free, well, it is sometimes a free queen, but in this case, it's not a free queen because there's just a checkmate. So we had rook takes d1, then queen b3 going for the queen exchange, getting into an endgame. And once again, that knight coming in handy because it defends the bishop. But now rook on the 7th, which is problematic to deal with. And that is the situation that we're currently sitting in. I mean, you have a lot of things attacked over here, and I was about to say you don't really want to play bishop d8. Bishop d8 is quite a sad move to do because it does block your rook in, but it's necessary in order to try and make sure that the house doesn't fall, essentially. And yes, the South African accent, that is the strange noises you are hearing at the moment. All right, we've got the knight hopping to a4. Possibly it might go to c5 after this bishop moves. Rook's going back. Clearly it's deciding that it's a little bit more active. Black is really tangled up if you look at these pieces, which is why the knight is hopping back. Because just in this situation, bishop over here is not looking too great. And yeah, black's pieces are just, this rook is not active at all. And a very important thing to know is in the endgame, activity is really important. It's the one time that it is often good to look at activity rather than material, sometimes to give up a pawn in order to get your rook more active. Because frequently if you play passively in the endgame, you just end up getting steamrolled by your opponent, and it's not a very pleasant thing at all. Black's starting to get a little bit more active, which is great. Time-wise, we have 16 seconds versus 30 seconds. With white, the higher rated player, not doing as well on time, but the position does look fairly even. So we're going to have a blunder in time trouble in order to get a decisive result over here, or possibly a flag. Flags also get the job done in terms. Oh, okay, we've got a knight trade, and you have the decision then: do you take with the bishop or the knight? Okay, the king goes across here, and we've got ourselves a rook endgame. Fortunately, this pawn is defended, so opted to save the knight and go for a bishop versus knight endgame instead of just trading the bishop and the knight as well. Which probably makes sense because you do have, once again, those forking chances with the knight. It's great to just make sure those still exist. And okay, the king's currently in a pin, so white might be able to pick up a bishop at some stage in future if there is some mistakes. But black is having none of it, carrying on playing actively with the pieces, and you just have to be careful that there are no checkmating threats. It looks as though, fortunately, none of these squares are being covered, so white is still fine. But time-wise, still 5 seconds versus 13 seconds. So easy to make a mistake. And giving up the knight. Okay, giving up the knight, but you got 4 pawns, and they connected pass pawns on each side of the board. Black fortunately has a bishop, so it can at least switch across from different sides of the boards, attacking and defending. I genuinely don't know. We can take a sneak peek. This is apparently dead drawn. Apparently dead drawn according to the engine. A tricky position to play though. Slightly less tricky when you drop 2 of the pawns on one side of the board. And now you really have to watch out for checkmating threats on the side. We had a draw offer, taking valuable seconds out of, well, it was declined by Zubov, but possibly I think it was because of a move. And now this is definitely drawn because the bishop should be able to just give itself up for the 2 pawns. The king is on the right side of the board. And once again, they know their theory so well. It is a rook pawn, and a rook pawn, we looked at it previously where if you have a bishop and a rook pawn and your bishop is the wrong color, it's a draw. But the same sort of reasoning holds if it's just a pawn. It's still a draw if it's a rook pawn and the opponent's king can get in front of that pawn. White must be winning. Unfortunately not. With the 2 pawns, I think there always just existed the possibility that black would be able to attack the pawns with a bishop and a rook, win the pawns, and then just give up the bishop for the other 2 pawns. What a game though. Very, very impressive. I suppose, I'm not sure if you would call this an upset or not. There's nearly a 200 rating point difference, so I suppose it's a mini upset. And Zubov then doesn't manage to get the win, but 3.5 out of 4 is still a very impressive result in this strong field. And there is a rest as well after this round to just catch up and just calm down, see how things go. This is the last game happening in the round. All of the other players are on break at the moment, and we once again have one of these queen end games. Are we going to get another queen blunder over here? We now have a grandmaster versus a FIDE master, 2600 versus 2400. And white's king is battling to escape the perpetual checks. You have to be so careful over here that you don't blunder your queen or blunder into a checkmating threat. Fortunately here, your pawn is busy defending the queen, so stepping on the same file isn't going to end up blundering the queen. White is just so close to promoting that pawn. It's really frustrating that you aren't able to do it. But I was busy wondering if you can't hide on g8, and then if there's a check, you go queen to f7. Surely, am I confused about this? So I'm thinking if you go over here, I suppose you then can't promote your pawn. But if you stop any checks at least, because any checks you just block with queen to f7, and you're attacking the king and attacking the queen at the same time. But let's just try and see what's actually happening in this game. The king is running all over the world, trying to win the other pawn perhaps? Oh, and this is tricky. So after you step out, you get check, and that gives you another move. Sadly, not enough. I was wondering if you couldn't just promote the pawn over there when you had an extra move. Maybe you were dropping the queen in some way. The players have 8 seconds, 5 seconds. They're playing on increment. All right, and now the king goes to g8. Now that pawn is out of the way, and there we go, getting the check, and now it is game over for black. Unfortunately, you have to trade, and then white just has the pawn to promote. That was an absolutely crazy game. Nice to catch that one as well. And that does mean that we are heading into the break. It's been 4 rounds so far. And let us have a quick look at the standings before we head off into the break. It looks as though it's still updating on my side. There we go. We have Hikaru on 4 out of 4. Eric Hansen on 4 out of 4 as well. Jabava on 4 out of 4. Denis Makinov, RD Forever, Vuga Manafov. We have how many players on 4 out of 4? It is 20 players. This is still anyone's tournament. It's not over yet. Some really, really tough competition for all of the top seeds. And if you slip up here, there's so many other players who are still on full score. We'll see how things change after the next break, though. We still have a lot of rounds left. 7 rounds. We're only about a third of the way through the tournament so far. We're gonna head off for a break now. Make sure that you come back in a couple of minutes. We'll start in 5 or so. Yeah, I think it's a 6-minute break. So we should be starting fairly soon. So don't go anywhere except to grab your popcorn and grab your snacks. And I will see you all very soon. right, welcome back. We are about to kick off round 5 of this week's Titled Tuesday. We've had some really great chess so far. Seen some upsets, we've seen some crazy tactics, we've seen some queen blunders. We have absolutely seen everything. I see there was a question in chat earlier as well saying, how does Hikaru maintain his 3200 rating playing against mostly 2900 rated players? I think the key is he just wins. It's always a great way to improve your rating or keep your rating the same level. He just doesn't lose games, it seems. On the rare occasion, he draws some games, but mostly good. I'm sorry for cutting off the epic music. Alright, and it looks as though the games have kicked off. We will just wait for the list to refresh. In the meantime, we can just do a quick reminder that this is the format of the tournament. So it's 11 rounds happening every single Tuesday, a Swiss event, meaning that as we get further on in the tournament, the people with the most points play against each other, and we see the top seeds busy battling it out. And we've got quite a few prizes available for the winners, as well as an additional prize for the best female player and a prize for the best placed streamer in the event. I think we can start off. Let's have a look at this game over here. We can look at it is Mykola Bortnik versus Alec Oskrowski, who I think has streamed on Gotham's Chess's channel a couple of times in the past, if I'm not mistaken. So we have e4, knight f6. Often the response here is to just carry on pushing your pawns forward to chase the knight around, but I have no doubt this is also some theory, probably not a pre-move. Doing some, you don't often want to take the knight over here because it helps centralize the queen if you take back. And then e6 to support the knight, d4 just getting some space in the center, opening up things for the dark squared bishop, and deciding not to trade the bishop for the knight at this point. You don't want to play something, and this is a move that beginner chess players often make, protecting the bishop like this, because first of all, you're giving up your bishop for a knight, and often at the start of the game, you want to try and hang on to your bishops and not give them up for knights. You want to trade bishop for bishop. And then another thing is you're ruining your pawn structure a little bit if you do something like this. So it decided to go back with the bishop, then the bishop went to d7? Okay, it had to get out somewhere, and unfortunately e6 was blocking it in, so that's why we're seeing a strange series of moves almost, but you're getting a bishop to the knight's diagonal, and both players are now getting close to completing their development. White has a little bit of a lead in development so far. You've got your king to safety, you've got your knights and your bishops all out. Black is a couple of moves behind, but it shouldn't be too much of a disadvantage, I wouldn't think. All right, so we've got a4 on the board, and black decides to not just castle. You do need to be aware of what your opponent is busy doing as well. The opponent was threatening to probably go a5, getting some more space, and also asking the question, where's your knight gonna go? So black decides to stop that pawn's advance with a5 before castling, and now black has completed the development, maybe with some slightly more awkward placed pieces. It's not a usual setup, but the key thing is the king is safe, the pieces are off their back rank, and now we can actually start playing the game and see how it goes. All right, h6. Possibly it's a move sometimes to keep a knight or a bishop off of the g5 square. Often it's just to create some space, some breathing room for your king so that you don't get back rank mated in future. And white also decided to do h3. The one disadvantage with this though, although I don't think it'll play too much of a role in this game, is when you push pawns in front of your king, it creates what we call targets. So it's something for your opponent to attack, and sometimes it's even something for your opponent to sacrifice a piece on. So something like bishop h6. It doesn't always work. You need to make sure that it does work when you actually do sacrifice your bishop, but okay. I'm losing my train of thought there as I see the move g takes f3. First of all, clearly not watching the broadcast because ruining the pawn structure and having some pawn islands like we spoke about earlier. But I would imagine that the plan over here is probably a king h2 or king h1, maybe getting a rook to the g file and taking advantage of this open file and getting an attack going. Because then something like bishop takes h6 becomes really problematic. If you have a queen or a rook over here, you're in a lot of trouble. And here the threat is queen to e4, you're threatening mate in 1. It's an obvious threat, but to stop it, you're gonna have to push more pawns and create more weaknesses in your position and also more targets for your opponent to attack. So something like queen e5, if you play queen e5, if you play f5 over here, then you're dropping the e pawn. and this is quite weak. If you play g6, then bishop can swoop in and take on h6. You're taking advantage of the weak dark squares as well. So this is looking a little bit scary. Hikaru lost. It looks as though his game is still underway. I think he is also streaming, so you're able to just check in there quickly. But I assume he wouldn't have lost within the first 2 minutes of the game. And there we go. We have this queen e4, which is why the rook went across here to defend e6. But now you can see, once again, there are a whole lot of weaknesses in this position. Black is starting to strike back a little bit, though, with queen to h4. And I'm guessing, yeah, queen to f1 seemed to be the only reasonable way to defend against this. King g2, unfortunately, you're still blocking off the g file, and king h1 doesn't defend the pawn, and king h2 was illegal because the bishop is covering that square. Here, presumably after takes, pawn is going to take back because the knight is covering this. You don't want to take the bishop over here because then the knight hops into the game and then it's threatening things like h3 and g2, and suddenly white's in a lot of trouble. So we'll see if white is going to end up getting punished for taking back with the pawn. I'm not sure if that was too ambitious. The attack kind of got going and then it stopped quite quickly. So we'll see what ends up happening. There's also quite a big time difference. We're down to 20 seconds versus 40 seconds, which could be the nail in the coffin for white, but we'll see how well he manages to fight back. You do have the bishop pair, but it is a fairly closed position. If you look, all of the pawns are kind of blocking the bishops out. These pawns are all making this bishop not great, and black still has an attack that you have to worry about. Queen over here. This pawn might be problematic. Fortunately, we do have a pawn on f2 busy covering that g3 square, so we don't have something like... They're moving too fast to let me draw arrows. You don't have something like rook g3 and queen across to h4. You do possibly have this, though. This looks fairly scary. You can defend with queen f1, but your pieces are being so inactive. And you always have to just carry on babysitting these two pawns. And you don't really want a powerful piece like a queen to be babysitting pawns. You'd ideally want it to take part in the attack. This, though, I'm wondering if there might be some counterplay after f5 has been played. Is rook e5 not a move? Okay, it is a move. It has been played. The rook then hops back to defend this. You don't want to let your opponent cause chaos on this side of the board while all of your pieces are still tied up, busy defending. And white is striking out in the center with 1 second left on his clock, which is terrifying, but it's not over yet. It is just looking like a really uncomfortable position to play. One that you would like to have a good 5 to 10 minute think about just to figure out how you try and survive this. But you can't think for 10 minutes when you only have a second on your clock. And a pawn is dropped, and that a pawn is an absolute monster, but not as much of it's a monster as the queen on f2. The dog is barking in the background, just agreeing over there. It's a great game. Tough luck over there for Oskrowski, but I mean, Bortnik showing us how it is done with the attack. That is another good concept to keep in mind. What happened in this game was there was a whole lot of threats on the king side, and white was having to defend against that. And then suddenly the chaos was happening on the queen side. So switching from different sides of the board, often your opponent then just can't, they don't have enough defensive resources to deal with all of that. So very good technique over there and instructive chess from a three minute chess game. Let's see which games are still going on. Looks as though Eric Hansen's game is still underway. 2 seconds versus 4 seconds. There are a lot of games still going on with hardly any time left on the clock. Black has a rather scary looking pawn on d3, and the king is very active. Getting the king in front of the pawn, pushing it. I don't think we get a Philidor position over here. It's a lot more tricky when we do have pawns on the board still. Some of the theory applies, some of it does not. And Hansen is the one with the advanced pawns, but not dropping pawns. You need to make some magic happen with this pawn, else it is over on this side of the board. There we go, gets the rook, but now you have to stop the 2 pawns. Oh no, and I don't think you can stop the 2 pawns. Couldn't you have gone here? Generally 2 pawns beat a rook. Although over here, I mean, there's a 3rd pawn on the board as well, which causes some more complications. And white is turning this around. This is starting to look very scary, but after you can't take, and black just gets the win. No, it's a stalemate. Okay, I lied. It was not a win. I thought it was going to be a win. I'm not sure if it was missed that it was a stalemate. I'm not sure if that was voluntary. I'm sure you guys can figure out, or you can check in and see what was happening over there. The key thing is usually, so if the king wasn't over here, then you would have a situation. That's why I wondered why you couldn't just push the pawns earlier. Maybe the king is too close, unfortunately. But if the king was further away, 2 pawns on the 6th rank usually beat a rook because of the fact that you can push one of the pawns and the rook can only deal with one of them. If it goes over here, you just push your other pawn and one of your 2 pawns is going to end up promoting. But over here, you couldn't promote to a queen after pushing the pawn because it is pinned by the rook. I have no doubt Hansen knew that this was a draw after taking. Unfortunately, you have no other options in this position. Crazy game though, and that does mean 2 more players dropping out of full score after 5 rounds, and we've moved on to round 6. That was one of the last games that were taking place. Yes, no choice to accept anything other than stalemate as black here, because if you move your rook somewhere else, you're just going to end up, they're going to promote and get a queen, and then you're probably doing worse. And it's a rook pawn once again. We see this recurring theme. Rook pawns are problematic because I was wondering about something like king over here, and then if you promote a queen going here, but unfortunately the king is here, so even if you win this, white is going in this direction. Yeah, unfortunately both of the pawns are close enough, and the kings are close enough that I think you do end up just getting the draw. All right, let's jump over to the next round though. We have this game underway, so it's Bortnik versus Igor Kovalenko. We have how many players still on full score after 5 rounds? That is more than halved. We're now down to 8 players still on full score, and this is the halfway point of the tournament. So this is really important to try carry on winning the games. We can go back and just have a look at how this game started off. So starting off with the e4, we're seeing knight f6 in quite a few of these games. Basically a replica of the previous game, although there we had the awkward bishop moves coming here and here in order to get active. All right, so black has opted for a slightly different setup in this game. The bishop goes all the way back to f1, which looks a little bit strange, but it's a safe space to put the bishop. The bishop isn't doing too much on b5. d3 is an awkward place to put the bishop as well. So it makes sense. You can maybe in future go something like g3 and bishop to g2 and try and get your bishop active along this diagonal. But we'll see what white ends up doing. It's also a nice defensive move. It is just covering the g2 square. The knight is covering h2, and you don't have to worry about an attack. So h3 making some space, g3, there we go, preparing to put the bishop on g2, I'm assuming. Yep, and there we go, it went to the square, and the players just carry on with their development, and it looks like white might try and play for an attack at some stage, just based on how the pieces are being placed. Although, as I say that, then the queen goes back, and it's fairly passive, and white is now offering to just exchange possibly queens. But black decides to rather hang on to the bishop pair rather than giving up the bishop for the knight. All right, we've got an a4 push. Black is just closing everything down on the queen side. And I mean, usually the way you're supposed to figure out which way you should be playing is you look at your pawns and where they're pointing. Unfortunately, yeah, that doesn't help us too much, I don't think, because they're pointing off the side of the board. And that's not really where we try to play our chess games. Bishop to f4, we're possibly setting up some tactics. Because now if this knight moves out the way, we're attacking the queen. A common tactic is if the rook is over here, it's to hop the knight to g6, where you're defending the bishop and you're busy attacking the rook. But that's not a possibility over here. And that almost looked like a blunder, but the fortunate thing is we did have the fork over here. We're picking up the exchange if we want it, but white might decide to just hang on to it, maybe go something like queen to h5. Threatening this pawn, decides to rather just go for the exchange. It's always a tricky decision to make. You can win material, or you can hang on to it, just don't take the material but hope that you get an advantage in some other respect with an attack. So obviously deciding for what was seen as the safer option and just deciding to go for the extra exchange, which is still tricky though. It's hard to when you are in exchange up because you still each have one piece. It's just that one piece is a little bit more powerful than the other. Right, we've got a rook to d2, just defending in case anything happens over here. Rook b3, yeah, rook b3 to win the d pawn, I would assume. Yes. Remember, once again, this goes back to the whole concept of activity over material. So often trying to trade off pawns, trying to just make sure your rook is active rather than just passively defending pawns, if that was even possible in that position. which I don't think it was. And pawn-wise, so each player has 3 pawns on the board. White is starting to run this, run this pawn, but I don't think it has any future because our bishop is defending this. Our bishop, you just don't want to let it get onto the, get too close, because White's bishop is still defending the A8 or the promotion square, and you can't put your bishop on this diagonal as well. So it's tricky to play over here for both sides. It's definitely far from over. White obviously has the material advantage of the rook, but once again, remember the knights can be really tricky, so we have to watch out for forks. There's still a lot of pieces on the board, so black definitely has some counterplay and some chances. But I do notice as well that the time is fairly equal, so you're not really going to have some major time trouble blunders at this stage yet. Is Alexander Bortnik playing today? I see he is. Second and third board, those are the Bortniks at the moment. I don't know if they are related. They both have US flags. I'm not sure if that is enough to say that they are related, but they are crashing it in today's Titled Tuesday. Slightly worse in this position though. So we'll see if some magic is able to be pulled off. At some stage, you might even consider giving the exchange back in order to help you just promote the pawn. But right now is not the time to do it. Your pawn is too far back. But also it's tricky to try and promote the pawn or push it and advance it at all, because this bishop is so nicely covering the A6 square. White's king is starting to enter the attack. Unfortunately, you can't do anything like this because the knight is covering the F3 square. And White's now opting to just go and attack the king a little bit. Possibly the plan here is to try and pick up a pawn or two on this side, and then to try and advance your pawn, giving back some material. But it is tricky because black has these 2 connected pawns, and this one's a passed pawn. Not that you're going to start moving it anytime soon, but you need to find a way to make progress here as white. You can't just... It's hard to just accept a draw when you are up material, although it looks as though a draw is what is going to happen. There we go, a repetition, and it is game over. So once again, 2 more players being knocked off of full score, but still a very respectable 5.5 out of 6. And we should have 1 or 2 games still going on. Let's go and watch Bortnik, the Alexander Bortnik's game, and see how that one's progressing. Down to 11 seconds, which is a little bit scary. A very tightly contested match, 2800 versus 2900. We are starting to see some really, really tough pairings for the players, but fortunately not too much longer until a break once again, and then they can just refresh themselves before they start with the next round. Yeah, oh, that's a really awkward move for white now. Your knight has to go all the way back. You have problems over here. I was trying to figure out if it did work to sacrifice the queen over here, and it did, because you're then promoting. The rook and the queen were the only 2 things stopping the pawn from promoting. So here now white's an entire rook down, which is not really ideal, not what you want to be happening in your chess games. White does have 2 extra pawns, but I don't think 2 pawns is going to be enough compensation. Although time might be a factor. Has Denlas realized that he has 3 seconds left on his clock, 4 after that 1 second was added, but that is scarily close to a flag. And anything can happen here. You're still up a lot of material, but with not a lot of time, it's easy to make a mistake. There we go, trading the queens. The knight is still existing for possible forks in future, and these pawns, you got to get them moving if you have any chances of trying to win or draw this game. Though I suspect you're still over here just playing for a draw. Knight doing a great job of defending. White's now trying to create some counterplay on this side of the board. Presumably we'll be bringing the king closer at some stage. Dropping one of the pawns though, which is really unfortunate. And starting to lose any hope of a comeback. Not a great round at the office for the Bortniks in this game. Alright, so we're going back down. An entire rook it's impossible to come back from, I think, and the knight is being chased around as well. You're gonna, you almost dropped this pawn, but unfortunately, fortunately for white had this push and the knight is still defending. You just need to make sure here that your king and your rook are going to be very far apart so that there's no chance of you busy falling into a fork. But okay, there we go. The knight is gone, and now it is properly game over. This rook move is really, really strong and something that's a good idea to just pause on quickly. The key thing being over here that your rook is now cutting off the king. It's a very common theme in endgames. You cut off the king and you make sure the king can't can't get to the other side of the board either to attack your pawns or to protect their own pawns. And here, after the king's cut off, this pawn is then just going to fall. There's no way for the white king to get back across and defend it. So very nice technique over there for Denlas. A big win in round 6. And he carries on full score. Alexander Bortnik, another very strong contender. And I think, didn't he do quite well in the Lindoria's rapid or blitz as well? And unfortunately moving on to round 6 with 5 points, which is still a great score, but not exactly what you want if you're trying to go for the top spot, especially this week where so many players seem to be not slipping up at all. All right, this is one of the last games going on. We have Jabava versus GM Direch. I'm not entirely sure who that is. Maybe chat knows. And it's of course completely drawn because you just give up your bishop for the knight. Let me not say it's completely drawn, because there's always the possibility of a fork. It's very easy to step across and be forked by the knight and then to drop your bishop and then it's game over. But theoretically, this is supposed to be very easy to get a draw. The whole idea being that if you give up your bishop for the knight, you end up then just... It's a draw because you cannot checkmate when you only have a knight left. All right, so down to 10 seconds versus 5 seconds. Black, of course, which is Jabava, still playing on in this position because here it's not disrespectful to play on. There's still the chance of a fork. Your opponent has 5 seconds left on the clock. Anything could happen. And there's also the chance to possibly block the bishop out with the knight. It requires some maneuvering, but you could potentially win the bishop somehow over here. And there we go. Now it is a draw. So very sneaky over there, saying, sure, take my free bishop, but then I'm going to take your pawn, and it is game over. All right, and I think that brings us to the end of the round. It does bring us to the end of the round, so we're moving on to round 7. The next break is going to be after round 8, and a lot fewer players on full score. We're down to 3 players on full score, and those 3 players, it is Hikaru, Denlas, and GM Dmitry. I can try and pull up the names. So Denlas is Denis Lazovic from Belarus, and GM Dmitry is, I'm presuming Dmitry, is Dmitry Kolas from Germany. So 3 players on that perfect score, and then we have 5 players on 5.5 out of 6. We have Igor Kovalenko, Swimmer Chess, Harsha, Tigre, and Mykola Bortnik. Not that many players left, and top 10, it's Jabava and Eric Hansen, who are on 5 out of 6 and leading the 5 out of 6 players on tiebreaks. Shall we? Okay, let's actually check in on one of Hikaru's games because we haven't seen any of his games so far this evening, and I feel like we have to have a look over there. So Hikaru is starting out with e4, e5. So even the grandmasters play standard chess like this. We're going for Roy Lopez and okay, exchanging the knight and going for the quiet knight d2, then c3, getting the rook across. The knight at some stage in future, I was about to say, might go back to f1 and then hop to e3 or g3. But Hikaru opts instead for knight to c4, where you're attacking the bishop and the knight, and then he gets to e3. So same destination, just a slightly different route in order to do it. And his opponent has possibly slightly awkward pawns for an endgame with the doubled pawn. But an advantage of this is that you are busy controlling this d4 square with both of your pawns. Knight hopping to f5 and black immediately takes it. The key thing being that this bishop isn't really doing too much, whereas the knight, it's attacking your queen, the bishop, it's attacking this square, it's possibly attacking this square as well. So it's quite a strong knight. You're happy to give it up. And white now does need to be careful that you don't drop this pawn without getting some sort of compensation in response. Black's starting to take some time over here, 30 seconds down on the clock, which is always a little bit scary when you're playing against Hikaru, unfortunately. This bishop is also looking like a glorified pawn. It's not really going anywhere, so it's attacking, it's defending these 2 pawns, it's defending this pawn, but it has nowhere to go. At some stage in future, you're going to have to play c4 or e4 in order to just get your bishop into the game. And with a move like queen f7, it looks as though c4 might be the route to go. If we just count how many defenders and how many attackers there are, there's currently 2 attackers. So the knight was attacking it as well, but you had your knight and your queen defending. And the general rule is if you have the same number of defenders as there are attackers, then the piece is safe. It cannot be taken. So there that pawn push was possible, which is why Hikaru then played the move c4 to make sure that the pawn couldn't be pushed forward. And if the pawn can't be pushed forward, your bishop is not going to see the light of day along this diagonal unless you're able to do something like b5, but then b3 keeps things fairly solid. The one disadvantage, of course, with pushing the pawn to c4 is this pawn on d3 might become weak at some stage in the future, and it is attacked by this, but rook e3 does the dual job of defending and attacking. So you're lifting the rook, threatening to swing it across to the side of the board, but you're also busy defending your weak d3 pawn. And black is scrambling to try to get the pieces in the game, going back with the bishop. It wasn't doing too much on d6. At least here it's defending g7. You don't want to fall to a kingside attack over here before you've even managed to do anything with your pieces or your life, really. I see a request to see Levy's game. Let's stay on this game for a little bit and then we'll switch across. I have found the game on the list, so it is quite nice and high up in the list. And we can check in and see how he is doing. We'll first just see what's happening in this game, how the players manage to progress, and if Denlas manages to untangle himself a little bit in this current position, or if Hikaru manages to launch a crazy attack. This does look like quite a problematic move, though, or at least a little bit of a freeing move for black. I think it gave up a pawn. No, it didn't. You managed to get the c-pawn. So definitely doing some untangling over there. And now if we look at the bishop is a lot more active if you put it on d6 compared to how active it was earlier. I'm not sure if you can put it on d6 now, though, because after bishop takes, pawn takes, your d-pawn is quite weak. So possibly that's why Denlas opted to rather just go rook across, because now you can put the bishop here, take back, and you've already got a defender. Possibly even just planning on going here in order to try and untangle yourself. Let's jump in quickly and have a look at Levy's game before it ends and check in and see how this is going. Doing really well at the moment, 5 points out of 6. And yeah, we missed his climb up through the standings. Material-wise, we're completely equal. Chasing away that rook on c5, you don't want to give them time to just double up the queen and the rook, which can be a little bit problematic. Although probably the rook's just heading to c2, where it should be quite happy, busy attacking the a2 and the f7 pawn, probably. Taking some time to think though, and opting to rather go for a defensive move. This is a very strong opponent. Rasmus Vane, I'm not sure if he's won Titled Tuesday before, but I've definitely seen his name among the top places in the event. So a really tough opponent over here. We've got, okay, so each side has a knight. You do need to, oh wait, there was a tactic over there. So that was very important to look at. There are 2 attackers over here, and you only have 2 defenders. With the rook back here, you don't have this pawn as a defender because it is pinned to the king. So that's why the rook had to go back, because if the rook didn't go back, you then have problems after knight takes d5, your knight's being attacked and your queen's being attacked. And you can't even exchange because then you just get mated on g7. So a very tactical game. We'll jump ahead. They've had a couple of exchanges. The queens and the knights are now gone. And it looks as though Levy is just up an entire pawn. It is a double pawn though, and he only has 16 seconds left in his clock, which is not a lot of time. But we trust he can find the best moves in the situation and prove that not all rook endgames are drawn. Unfortunately, dropping a pawn over there, picking up this one, but you need to hang on to some of your pawns in order to make sure that you do have some winning chances in this endgame. All right, down to 10 seconds versus 30 seconds. White is swinging the rook across, so going for this trade, with the whole idea being that if you trade off these 2 pawns, you now only have to focus on this side of the board. You don't have to worry about black getting some counterplay with a passed pawn. I think this looks quite drawish though. I'm checking with the engine as well. White has a slight edge, so maybe it can turn into something. The problem is that both of the kings are very close to the pawns, so black does have a defender ready, and it's hard to make progress. You at some stage will want to get a passed pawn with one of these pawns, or if you can win this pawn, that would be ideal. Then you just have a passed h pawn that can cause some problems while you win this pawn in the middle and manage to push through. Okay, black's still playing actively, still trying to defend. You also always have to, the thing that's really frustrating in rook endgames is often your king just gets checked and you have no way of escaping the checks. We might be seeing that happening over here. Fortunately, this rook is doing a great defensive job, so you could move your king out of the way and a little bit closer. But now you have to start babysitting this pawn with the king, so you can't run too far forward. 3 seconds left on the clock. Is Levy going to be able to get a clutch win over here? I was looking possibly at rook, king to f5. Don't know if that's too aggressive though. Once again, you still need to watch out for tactics and for mating threats in an endgame, even though there's so few pieces on the board. And that rook, fortunately, having this square to go to, it was almost trapped. And you're seeing this problem of the rook just keeps on checking the king, and you have to keep on going back and defending the pawn. So I think we're possibly going to end up in a draw, which is a great draw for Levy, though. I mean, against a 2900 rated player. Maybe he's going to push on for the win, though. It's now 3 seconds to 12 seconds. There we go, and it is the draw. Great draw over there for Levy, given the rating difference. Just unfortunate not able to convert the extra pawn advantage. But this is why we do have the saying that all rook endgames are drawn, because so frequently an extra pawn, or sometimes an extra 2 pawns, just isn't enough to win the entire game. Let's go check in what happened over here. Did Hikaru and... oh, it was a draw. Okay, so with the queens on the board, so white had an extra pawn once again, so extra pawn not enough to win the game. Unfortunately, the black queen was probably too active. I see both of them had a similar amount of time on the clock by the time it ended. So tricky over there, but that means another 2 players who are no longer on full score. It all depends what happened in GM Dimitri's game, and it looks as though he won on the updated standings, which means we have a sole leader as we head into round 8. We're not heading into round 8 yet, though. There are still 1 or 2 games underway. And here we have an endgame where we have a bishop and a pawn versus nothing, essentially. But fortunately for white, this time it is not an H-pawn. If the pawn was on this side of the board, it would be a draw. This side of the board would be fine, because as we saw earlier, it's the correct colored bishop, so it's a light squared bishop. But when the pawn's in the center of the board, it doesn't matter at all. I think even if the bishop was gone over here, you possibly still... okay, then I think it's a draw, unfortunately. The bishop is not there. But with the bishop, you can always just waste time by moving the bishop out of the way. And your pawn is going to just promote to queen. Once again, here we have the wrong colored bishop. It's crazy how many of these endgames end up going into a rook pawn endgame. Either just a rook pawn or a rook pawn and the incorrect bishop. So this once again completely drawn. Black can just pre-move for the rest of the time. They can just pre-move king h8 and king g8. And there's absolutely no way for white to make any progress. So 2400 versus 2600. This is a nice result for FM Mykola Fedor. Moving on to 4 points. Well, both of them will move on to 4 points after 7 rounds, which as well is a very respectable score in such a strong event. Okay, by now Black could have probably won the pawn, but I mean, why go to extra effort when you could just move back and forth, king g8 and king h8, and there we go, we finally get the repetition. This is where it's a great thing to have, to be playing online, because the computer automatically tells you when the position is repeated 3 times. When you're playing over the board, you have to actually claim the draw, and that can be tricky to do, especially in a situation like this where it's not just the standard back and forth repetition. There were quite a few moves in order to get to that point. All right, but that does bring us to round number 8. Let's have a quick look at the standings before we head into that. So we have GM Dimitri on full score, 7 out of 7. Hikaru is leading the 6.5 out of 7ers, which is 4 people. Actually, he's leading it by an absolute hair, because Swimmer Chess also has a tiebreak of 31.25. And then we have Harsha Barathakoti and Den Lars are the other 2 players on 6.5 out of 7. And now those players on 6 out of 7 are tantalizingly close to leading the field. They just need to make sure they win the rest of their games, and anyone still has a chance then of winning if Dimitri does slip up. And we have seen in past editions of Title Tuesday, I think it's only happened once that someone's finished on full score. So it is not over yet. Even if you've dropped half a point or an entire point, there's still a lot to play for. I think we're going to jump over. Why don't we go and check Jeffrey's game? We saw one of Jeffrey's games at the start of the tournament, but we haven't seen him in a little bit. So he is currently on 6 points, so not too far behind the leaders. We started off with a d4 and a London system, which is showing people it's played at all levels. Some nice development over there. Oh, Black chasing the queen around though, and both players just getting their king to safety, developing their pieces, and then getting ourselves a game. So this is the point that we're currently at. b takes c4, opening things up a little bit. And I'm wondering if they might even be, okay, you can't put a rook on the c file because then white can just push the pawn forward. I was looking at possibly trying to take advantage of the pin that you can't take over here because your queen's being attacked, but you always have to remember pawns can be pushed forward. It is something that is sometimes quite frustrating. And this knight is now causing some mild annoyance over here in terms of it is protected by the bishop. It keeps on harassing this rook. And now the question is, I was about to say, where do you move it? Are we just going for a repetition? Okay, well, that was quite a quick game. Jeffrey finishing with 2 minutes and 42 seconds on his clock against a slightly lower rated opponent, but it looks as though white has an advantage here. I would guess. Okay, well, white is up an entire pawn. And with a pawn push, it could be quite problematic. So it makes sense why Jeffrey went for the draw. His opponent possibly could have played on over there, but tricky. And also, it's the break. It sometimes makes sense to rather just take a draw or to resign a game if you're in a lost position. So we get a slightly longer break and can relax before the next round starts. Fortunately for us, this means we get some time to look at some other games, which is great. And yes, this is a live tournament. It's a live online tournament. So it's happening in real time, but it is all happening online, which is great as well because we have players from all over the world getting to play against each other, which doesn't usually happen. Usually there's travel costs involved. Not everyone can play, then it has to be invitation only. So this is great because absolutely anyone with a title is allowed to play Untitled Tuesday and play against some of the top chess players in the entire world. So here we have Swimmer Chess versus Denlize. It's still quite early in the game, so I think we can just quickly speed through and see how we got to this point. So starting off with d4, once again, you can see how well these grandmasters are just busy developing, getting their pieces out, getting their king to safety. So these are things that you can definitely learn from. Apart from maybe the bringing the queen out really early, that's not really advisable. Deciding not to take the pawn over here, I presume there's some activity that will be given to the opponent if that happens, although it almost looks as though it's just a free pawn. I'm not entirely sure why we can't take. Oh, that becomes really problematic. That is giving your opponent far too much activity and you only got a single pawn in exchange. So we had a c5, okay, exchanging some pieces, trading pawns, playing very, very solid chess, and then trying to undermine that bishop on d6, which is being very strong. And oh, finally giving up the exchange for the bishop, and this is the current situation that we're in. So black has just given up the exchange, decided that the bishop was stronger than the rook, and that often is the case. If you're able to get a knight or a bishop on the 6th rank if you're playing white, or then 3rd rank if you're playing black, often that piece causes so much frustration and just limits the pieces so much that it makes sense to give up a rook for the minor piece. Alright, so the bishop is now busy causing a little bit of an attack on g3. We have the knight there as well. And after this, I think you're just dropping this pawn. So it's interesting that white has opted for this. But on the other side, or on the other side of things, you are busy trading off some pieces. And remember, when you're up material, and here white is up in exchange, when you're up material, it's a good idea to try and exchange pieces. And this does result in the exchange of 2 pieces. But now from a material perspective, black has 2 pawns for the exchange. So just in terms of points, it's completely equal. And in an endgame, remember, pawns become so much more important. So you've got 2 versus 1 on the king side, and you've got 3 versus 2 on the queen side. That could cause some problems in future, definitely. Though we do also have to just watch out for a move like this, because you don't have the defensive resource bishop to c7. Because then you're giving up some extra material. Fortunately, you have this as a defensive resource. So you're offering, if you take my bishop, I'm going to just take your bishop. I'm wondering, though, if you can get... Oh, no. Was this a miscalculation, though? Oh, and it looks as though we are dropping another piece as black, which is really unfortunate. I think you can just take... Oh, there's a tactic. But you are now a clear bishop down rather than an exchange down, which is not great, and it is... Oh, black has 2 pawns on the side of the board, though, and 3 versus 2 on this side. So we still do have ourselves the game. White also doesn't have a lot of time. So you're a piece up, but you have 15 seconds versus 1 minute and 24 seconds, which is quite scary. Very, very scary. Tips or good ways to learn? Yeah, I see there are some resources in the chat. There are some great study directory resources on Chess.com, organized specifically for beginners. So you can go and have a look at that. And then There are a lot of great streams as well that you can watch in order to learn some chess if you are a beginner. Still in time trouble, we're down to 8 seconds versus over a minute, 1 minute and 20 seconds almost. And these pawns are starting to cause some problems. We're seeing once again the limitation of a bishop is that the bishop can't ever attack this pawn unless the pawn moves forward. So you need to make sure that you're not, you need to make sure that your king is stopping it. Very important that you don't take over here. If we just pause and go over here, this is a huge blunder to make because the rook can just go across. The king is covering these squares. You're not getting checkmated immediately, but you get checkmated a move later, which is not really what you want to happen in an endgame. So that is why white didn't just take that pawn and is still defending very solidly. Hard for white as well. Possibly this is I don't know if that is a plan because these pawns could be so dangerous with the king busy supporting it. So blocking out the rook is the option that white has decided to take. And now black takes that opportunity to push the pawn. You just got to keep pushing your pawns. The chances that you have over here being a piece down is you have extra pawns. We still have the problem that you can't take this pawn because of checkmate, although now both of those pawns have dropped. Both of those pawns have dropped. Was that? It definitely wasn't forced. And unfortunately after rook here as well, you're no longer, I mean, you could have picked up one of those pawns in exchange for your 2 pawns if I'm not mistaken. So now it's starting to look a lot scarier for black, and white is starting to solve quite a few of those problems. You also can't take advantage of any pin over here by going something like king to f4. We might see a bishop plus a rook versus a rook endgame, which I think... I'm not actually sure, maybe chat can let me know, bishop plus a rook versus a rook, is that winning or is that drawn? It's always complicated when you get to these sort of endgames. Alright, and black, remember, is heading in this direction, so you can't just take the rook over there. It would be great if you could just decide that your pawns could move backwards, but that is sadly not the rules that we play with in our chess. This pawn is possibly going to have some possibilities of promotion. We also have this to defend it. Okay, I don't think, unfortunately, that your pawn is advanced enough in order to sack the rook for the bishop. And now we have rook versus rook, so this is now a draw. Should be winning as long as you keep the a pawn. It is a draw. Insufficient material over there. It was a really tough game, really hard fought from both of these players, and that does mean 2 more players on 7.5 out of 8. Wait, no, sorry, they're on 7. They were on 6.5 at the start of this. They are now on 7 points. A draw with perfect play without pawns. Okay, so without the pawns, a draw, but perfect play is really hard to achieve as well. Still tactics. And I see we still have our board 1 game going on. Remember, GM Dimitri, the only player on full score so far. Hikaru has the black pieces. It's tricky to see when the kings are all on the side of the board. But unfortunately, I think this is a draw. Well, no, it's not a draw. Sorry, because you can move the rook across. What a nice win there from Hikaru. Sorry, the problem over here is the king is too far on this side of the board. So you have this tactic which happened on the board with the whole idea that first of all you're threatening to promote the pawn, and if they take the pawn then it's just rook to h2, and after the king moves you pick up the rook. So that's a common tactic to look out for. If you're trying to promote a pawn, well, rather, if you're defending, it's important to keep your king on g2 so that's not a problem. G2 or h2, something like that, so the rook can't go and threaten this tactic. Or the other thing that you need to watch out for is if you ever move your king up. Okay, it's not white to move. But if you move your king up, let's just make a move like this, then they have the idea to go check over here, attacking your king and getting out of the way of the promotion square. So very nicely done over there from Hikaru, which means that we no longer have a single player on full score after our 8 rounds. Hikaru is half a point off of full score, and GM Dimitri was the only player on full score at the start of this round, and he has just lost his game. So he's still among one of the top players in the field, but sadly no longer leading the entire field, and it looks as though Hikaru is clear leader, 7.5 points out of 8. We have quite a lot of players on 7 out of 8. The rest of our top 10 are all sitting on 7 points. Still too early to call it. We have 3 rounds left after this. We are going to be taking a break now, though. We'll be back in a couple of minutes to see, does Hikaru manage to maintain the lead that he has just got, or do some of the other players manage to cause a bit of an upset and overtake him? It's a really tough tournament tonight, but we can't wait to see what's happening soon. I'll be back in a couple of minutes and hope you guys have a good break. Welcome back to Title Tuesday. We have had 8 action-packed rounds so far, and we are heading into the final 3 rounds, and it is anybody's tournament to take. We are down now to 397 players. Obviously, a couple of players have flagged as they've gone on. The rage quit is real. Sometimes the tilt sets in and we do have to take a break. But we still have some players battling it out for the top spot. We can see the standings as we head into the next round. It is Hikaru, the sole leader. He managed to pull off a clutch victory at the end over there, moving into clear first place with 7.5 points out of 8. He beat the person who was leading the field before that, the only player left on full score after 7 rounds. And we have quite a few players on 7 out of 8. Actually, our top 10 players are all on 7 out of 8. So it is a tightly contested battle today. And no one knows who will manage to get the victory. Will we get Hikaru getting a back-to-back victory? Or will one of the other players manage to pull off a little bit of an upset? I'm sorry for interrupting your epic music. I know you guys are jamming to that during the break. I'm just waiting for my game list to refresh. I see on the first board we have Hikaru versus Jabava. I suspect both of them are streaming though, so let's go over to some players who might not be streaming their games. Let's go over to the second board, which is Denis Makinov versus Murad Ibrahimli, and we can just see what they have done so far. Started off with a d4. I feel like we're seeing more d4 today than we're seeing e4, which I'm not sure how we feel about that, but we're also seeing a lot more mainline or standard theory compared to in previous weeks where we've seen some very strange chess openings busy being played. So everyone just sticking to what they know, sticking to their solid openings over here, and that's nice for us because it's nice and educational, and we can see what sort of openings are played at a top level and what these players are doing against their very high-rated opponents. You can see here we have two 2900s battling it out, and I assume, yes, just getting the king to safety. King safety is really important. You don't want to mess around with weird tricks going for knight over here thinking you can trade off the bishops. Just get your king to safety. Keep it simple and only start doing crazy things once you have managed to take care of the most important piece on the board. Continue as a music stream. I feel like I can have a word with Chess.com and see if we can just have some longer breaks with longer music so that you guys can really enjoy the epic tunes. Maybe they can set when they know events happening, just have an epic music stream. Can do something like that. All right, we've got e takes f3, so it looks as though it may be problematic, but the bishop is out and kind of active. Your king can maybe just hide on g3 in the future, and you've traded off quite a few of your pieces as well, so you don't really have to worry about too much of an attack. It's going to be hard for black to get an attack going, especially with a knight on the side of the board, which is why we're not too worried about having this pawn on f3. And also because there is a d pawn as well, this pawn can't really be attacked at the moment. One disadvantage though is there might be, I'm saying there might be some outposts. We can go b3 over here to chase the knight away, which is fortunate, but something to think about in future and keep in mind. You don't want to play b4 over here and give that knight that c4 square where it can be really, really active. Where white is going here, I'm expecting probably we should get a rook swinging across and going for rooks on the 7th. Black also hasn't pushed any pawns yet, so there might be some back rank tactics that we have to keep in mind at some stage in future. All right, we've got a4 on the board as well. Possibly, I mean, if there's so much request for the epic Chess.com music, maybe there's a Spotify playlist kind of vibes that can happen in future that everyone could just feel really, really as though they're taking part in an epic battle when they're busy playing their chess games. All right, so getting that other rook to the e-file. If you don't do anything about it, rook e7 looks like a nice move. It's attacking b7 and it's attacking f7. Only problem is this knight is doing a great job of defending everything. And you also can't get your bishop into play because you can't go something like here in order to attack the b7 pawn. That's just hanging your entire bishop. We see as well that black has pushed a pawn so that there's not going to be any back rank threats. And it seemed really awkward going rook a6, and now rook b6 makes the move make a little bit more sense. You're possibly even heading for this b4 square. And because white isn't attacking, there's no crazy stuff happening on the board, you have time to play fairly slowly and take time to get your pieces to their dream squares. Here's, I think it's Jeremy Silman who suggests that what you're doing in games, if you can't really come up with a plan, you try and just imagine where you would like your pieces to be, and then you try and figure out, is there a way to get your pieces there? And that's presumably what black did. They imagined, I would like a rook on b4, and this seemed to be the best way to get their rook over there. Rook e3, let's just notice earlier that this was an important move because now you can move your queen away. Previously, your queen was busy defending the pawn on f3. You don't want to just drop this pawn because then the tables will have turned quite a bit and you then have to start worrying about king safety and even just weird like checks on d1. So yeah, king f3, just adding an extra defender in case you ever have to move this away. But I'm not really liking white's position too much at the moment, just based on the fact that the queen's the queen's having to defend this pawn. And we said it earlier as well, you don't really want to have a powerful piece defending or babysitting a pawn. Otherwise, okay, what was happening over there? Because I turned on the engine just to check if it agreed with that. Oh, wow. Okay, so queen takes a5. Queen takes a5 apparently gives a massive advantage. I'm guessing you're going to have something happening with the a pawn. It's not forking the rooks. It looks initially as though you are forking the rooks. But after rook takes d4, You managed to get a rook onto the 7th rank. I'm just playing a couple of engine, and then apparently rook d3 is the move that you're supposed to do. Okay, something that if you're interested, you can go and evaluate this yourself. I think we're going to go very far down the rabbit hole if we try to do that. So let's just stick with what was played, because then it's a lot more equal, and the evaluation does stand that black is a little bit better after rook d3. And we move on, and there we go. This is the position that is currently on the board. So we've traded off the a pawn for the b pawn, which could make this b3 pawn quite weak. The a pawn is going to be very, very strong if you manage to get rid of the b pawn. And we still have the c pawn as well, which could potentially in an endgame become a passed pawn, or help your d pawn, become a passed pawn. Black doesn't have the most time left though, so you gotta move speedily over here. And I realize we're not on the active game, so there we go. They did move speedily. Rook to d8 was played, and after bishop d7 was on the board to try and win this. Fortunately, the queen's still defending though, so we are happy with this position. What do you play here as white? I guess that is the real question. You've got to move your bishop; it's being attacked, or your alternative is to go here. Oh, are we losing? We're not losing the bishop. Fortunately, we do have those 2 pieces busy defending, but it is starting to look quite nice for black if we are able to maneuver our queen so that it's a little bit more active, or go for a queen trade and hope that our rook is better than white's. After this trade though, so after this and this, white is winning a pawn, so I'm wondering, oh, you're not winning a pawn because you dropped this pawn over here. Crazy pawn exchanges, and we're down to 2 seconds for black and 23 seconds for white, which makes it really, really difficult to play accurate moves in the endgame, especially when the queens are still on the board and you need to watch out. You don't want to suddenly find a situation where you're being checkmated. So the queens have been traded, which is great. Black opts to just hang on to this pawn because you've got your connected pass pawns. And presumably the king is going to come closer, come protect this, and then this is a real threat. After this as well, you can start pushing the pawns, or pushing the pawns now because your king can go to d5 to defend. Starting to look really, really scary for white. Although white's king is fortunately close enough to the action that it's not over. But now I think it might be. You needed that b pawn, unfortunately. You can't just let it go because now black is just rolling these pawns through, can even for style points like block and get the, oh no, that's a rook. And there are no stalemating chances either. So black playing incredibly well there with hardly any time left on the clock. I think we went as low as 1 second on the clock, but managing to get the win. Tough luck over there for Murad Ibrahimali, who played a really good game otherwise. We'll have to go back and just check why queen takes a5 was such a great move for white and winning the game according to the engine. But it went too deep for us to calculate, and clearly too deep for the Grandmaster or International Masters to calculate in the game. Let's go and try and see who is still playing after that. Do we still have our board 1 game happening, or is that over? We do have our board 1 game still happening. It is Jabava versus Hikaru. Hikaru, remember, leading the field, and Jabava only half a point behind. So everything to play for over here. Jabava is the one with the extra pawn who's playing for the win. I take it back. There's a very far advanced pawn. Fortunately, they queen at the same time. Which just gives Jabava the draw. Wait, is there a ladder? There's not a ladder checkmate. I was going to say, is there any chance you can like bring the queen up? But no, a draw. So a nice draw over there for Jabava not beating, but I mean, for 300 rating point difference, a draw against Hikaru, I feel like that's always a decent result. I'm not sure what happened previously in the game and if he will be happy with that. But that is not good news for Hikaru, because if we've had a decisive result in any of the other 7 out of 8 games, that then means that Hikaru is no longer the sole leader. Is Swimmer Chess, is their game still happening? Okay, so my standing list is still updating. We'll go and check fairly soon. Oh wait, we've moved on to the next round already. That was the last round, the last game of the round. So I'll wait a little bit for my standings to update on my side. I know you can't see them on the screen. There we go. So we have, now we have 5 players on 8 out of 9. We have Hikaru, Denis, Makinov, RD Forever, Aryan Tari, and GM Dimitri, all on 8 out of 9. We have 2 players, it's Jabava and Zkid on 7.5 out of 9, and then a whole lot of players on 7 out of 9, which are still not out of it. We have 2 rounds left in the tournament, and as we can see, it's very easy for the leaders to slip up. Let's go and have a look. We haven't seen, I think, did we see some of Arian's games? I'm not entirely sure, but he's busy playing against GM Rustam Kusnutdinov, who has won the event before, if I'm not mistaken. So a really tough matchup over here, and we'll see how it goes. They started off with e4, e5, knight f3. We've got ourselves a Petrov, which you don't see played too frequently. Well, I haven't seen it too frequently at this level, accepting the pawn. The whole idea is it looks as though you're giving up a pawn in the Petrov quite frequently, but you tend to get it back because you take advantage of this e-file, and white has to just make sure that they get their king to safety. So we'll be dropping the pawn fairly soon, and there we go. White gets the king to safety and just carries on with development, and this is where the game is currently at. We played h3 just to keep a knight off of g4 or a bishop off of g4, and also making a space for our king to go to. This maybe looks like a little bit of a strange move, opening up the diagonal, but fortunately there's no way to take advantage of it right now, so black will be able to play bishop b7 before there are any problems there. Of course, if you had a pawn though, pawn to d3 would be a little bit, it might be a little bit problematic, opening up this diagonal. The bishop is undefended. The knight can always hop back to c5 though, which might be a saving grace. It would end in some crazy tactics, because both of the queens would be attacked, but I think you still come out and you're okay. Right, so c3 is now on the board, maybe looking at a queen c2 in future possibly to connect the rooks, because you can't go queen d2 to connect the rooks. The knight is busy sitting over there. And queen e2 is also not something that looks very pleasant, because you don't want to put your queen on the same file as two rooks. That is just not a good strategy when trying to win games. We might still have some problems over here though. This knight is fortunately doing a good defensive job, but we have the two rooks busy attacking. Oh, and as I say that, the knight moves out the way. Is there any good move with the knight over here? Okay, so just going back with the knight, the threat of course is if you take this, then it's check here and your second rook takes and it's checkmate. There was nothing to defend the f1 square, and your bishop on h2 is now blocking your king. That's always something that you have to be a little bit careful of. You've made space for your king, but if you put a knight or a bishop there, knights may be better because it can hop back and defend. If you put a bishop there, you're just blocking your king's escape, which is not great. The bishop back here, it's busy defending. You still have to just be careful, because you need to make sure you're defending this d3 square. If we had instead something like queen over here, there might be some problems in future if you can dislodge this knight with a bishop to d3 and you can't take because our rook takes e1. So that's always something you have to just watch out for. Queen d2 was played though to defend the rook, and then bishop to f1. So all of white's pieces very, very close to the king, which is probably a good thing with the bishop and the queen lined up on the same diagonal. It's not a crazy attack, but you don't really want to get your opponent's pieces all up in your space. Okay, deciding to trade rooks, just relieve the pressure. Remember, when you don't have a lot of space in a position, then it's a good idea to try and exchange pieces so that you can just get some more breathing space. Your pieces then aren't quite as bad, and that's what white is trying to do. Because you can see as well that the bishops are just not really doing much. This knight is awkwardly placed. You can look at all of the squares that it can go to, and a lot of those are just not free, not safe spaces. Okay, I was wondering if there might be like a knight d5 over there. Maybe you want to keep the knight over there, I'm not entirely sure. But this bishop especially is making me sad. It's almost like a French bishop, although fortunately when the knight moves out of the way, it'll be a little bit more active. But still biting granite, it's just hitting those pawns, it can't really go anywhere. So bishop g3, possibly you're going to reroute it to f2, and then also you're no longer blocking your king's escape square if you want to hide behind your pawns. So black's also doing some maneuvering. You have to remember as well that after that knight move, oh, that's a little bit of a trick. So the tactic that's being set up over here is takes. You can't block. Oh wait, that would be horrible. That would be so bad. You can't move your king out of the way, and if you block like this, you're blundering your entire queen. So it's always a good idea to set up these little traps for your opponent. Give your opponent a chance to make a mistake. Obviously, RD Forever does not go for that, because that would be terrible, and it's only a couple of moves to calculate. But white is starting to turn things around. I definitely preferred black earlier, but now white is starting to look a lot more active, and think possibly even has a little bit of an advantage here, even though the material is equal, just based on the fact that now you've got the bishop pair, which are becoming a little bit more active, and also your queen is all up in black's business and possibly causing some problems. You have to look out for mating threats. You have to look out for loose pieces. So yeah, I think white is starting to have a much more pleasant game than they were having earlier. Right, pushing the pawn over here. I was going to say, can't you just take? I'm not sure if that was a missed tactic. You go back here, you're threatening a check, but that doesn't really do anything. Going across. Okay, so white has dropped a pawn. I don't know if I've jinxed. If I've jinxed over there. It should still not be like a massive advantage though for black if there is an advantage. Still based on the activity of the pieces. And also if you trade off the queens, you're maybe going to have a fairly drawish endgame. Opting not to win back the pawn and trade queens, so just ignoring everything that I was saying. Going presumably, I'm wondering, can you not just go bishop d7 over here? So bishop d7 with the idea the bishop can't take, and after knight takes, you can take back over here and exchange. Let's see what happened in the game. So we had, okay, that was not the plan. The plan was to go after the c7 pawn. All right, and Taria's down to 17 seconds on the clock, 23 seconds for his opponent. They're fairly equal in terms of rating. Actually, Taria is the higher rated player in this game. But they're both dangerously low on time, and this A pawn is running, which is really scary as well. Okay, fortunate. Oh, you can't take it back. You can't take it back because you lose your queen. That is absolutely horrible. I'm wondering though if you don't have queen to e7 at some stage in future, not after you've dropped the bishop. The bishop was busy defending the square really nicely. This, unfortunately, it looks really scary, but you've got nothing. And I think we might even see a resignation here. And we do. That was tough luck over there. There was definitely an advantage earlier in the game for white. But what even happened? How was the bishop lost? Oh, it was a forced loss of the bishop. Okay, that was really, really unfortunate. Possibly looking at this move once again could have been something. I'm not entirely sure. We can have a quick look if that did. Wait, white has an advantage over here. Yeah, queen e7. But so hard to find moves where you are under time pressure. It looks as though as well you're giving up this bishop. But I suppose, oh, you get two pieces. You get two pieces. You can possibly give up your bishop for this pawn for a draw if you have to, but you can probably just win the pawn outright. And also then you're stopping any threats of this. So really unfortunate to miss that tactic. And after that, it was game over. But a good win there for RD Forever. And Taria's only, okay, maybe a little bit too far behind in order to win the entire event, but still a very respectable score. We can go and see which games are still happening. We'll just wait a little bit of time for the list to update. I'm assuming the first game is over. Oh wow, game one was a draw. So that means once again that that's a chance for the players who have slipped up a little bit earlier in the event to catch up to the leaders. This is crazy. It is still anyone's tournament. The third game was a draw as well. Jabava versus GM Dimitri. Do we have any games still going on? Okay, we do have a couple of games still going on. It doesn't look as though any of them are the top games. Okay, as I click on that, it ends. Let's try to find a game that is still happening. There we go. We've got a queen versus rook once again. We can see if they're able to convert this. And it looks as though RD Forever, after that win against Tari, is now in the lead. And we got the checkmate. We're seeing a lot of players demonstrate how to win with a queen versus a rook, which is very impressive. And I think that was the last game of the round, which means round 11, the final round of today's event, will be starting in a couple of seconds. If we just focus on the standings going into the event, or going into the last round, we have RD Forever in first place on 9 out of 10. So he just needs a draw in order to get equal first. But obviously a win would be preferable because then you know that you're going to win and you don't have to worry about tie breaks. I am noticing as well that his tie breaks are not quite as high as some of the other players. Hikaru has, oh wait, the tiebreak is updated now on my side. So actually decent tie breaks, but you generally like to just win an event outright. You don't like to have to wait and see what happens in the other games. That's quite stressful and not nice to not have it in your control. We have 3 players on 8.5 out of 10. It's Hikaru, Dennis Makanov, and GM Dimitri. Some players putting on a very good showing. And then up to player number 15. Top 15 players all have 8 points out of 10 or more. still anyone's tournament. I mean, okay, we have 4 possible people who can win the event overall. It's RD Forever, Denis Makanov, Hikaru, and GM Dimitri. Unfortunately, the players on 8 out of 10 are too far back in order to win, but they can definitely still get 2nd, 3rd, or 4th place, which is still in the prize money. While I wait for the list to update, we can just quickly have a look once again at the prizes. So top 4 players walk away with some prize money, as well as the best female player in the event, and also the highest placed streamer after the 11 rounds. All right, the games have kicked off. I'm seeing Grischuk's name. He is busy playing against Hikaru. That could be a great game to look at. I think we're going to start off with another game, though, and then head back and see what happens over there. Is there any game... Actually, we should probably look at... I'm looking for RD Forever, but I'm not seeing him. Wait, he went for a draw. We got a Grandmaster draw on board 1. So RD Forever versus Denis Makanov. They have drawn their game before we even had a chance to look at it. No doubt it was a very high quality game. So that means the top board then is Hikaru versus Grischuk. But let's look at GM Dimitri versus Jospim, and we'll check in on the Hikaru versus Grischuk game fairly soon. All right, so let's look. We have e4, e5. We got a Sicilian. This is the first time we're seeing a Sicilian tonight, although I have no doubt there've been a bunch of Sicilians on boards we haven't had a chance to look at. Everything looking fairly standard. We're getting a Najdorf, but a slightly quieter variation of the Najdorf. And this looks as though you're blundering a piece, but the key thing is queen takes on c4 and knight takes on e7, so you win your piece back with check. All right, so we had a trade over there, just solidifying the bishop on d5. Important to only do this if your opponent doesn't have a pawn to attack your bishop with, because else you'll just be losing the bishop because your bishop is very much blocked in and can't go backwards. Okay, so that was traded. Everything looking pretty symmetrical in terms of pawn structure, and probably white will continue at some stage with a rook to c1 just doubling up on the c-file, but taking some time out of his day in order to just solidify this e4 pawn, which is being attacked. I'm not sure if you take over here, you have a lot of options to take back with. You can take with the pawn, you can take with the knight, you can take back with the queen. And I'm not entirely sure what GM Dimitri had in mind when he played f3. I kind of liked taking with the knight because then you're hitting the d6 square, but then bishop to f5 can trade off that knight. We will never know though, because it was not played. We did have a trade over here, and now white has some nice control over the c-file, with the only problem being you can't really get to c6 at this stage because the bishop is still covering it. And you do also have to watch out for possible tactics on this side of the board. So we'll see how it goes. All right. b4 on the board, just to make sure that these pawns can't advance anymore, just getting the pawns stuck on the same color as the bishop. The only disadvantage though, we've got opposite colored bishops over here. So let's say you trade the knight for this bishop, then you're going to end up with opposite colored bishops, and your bishop can't do any attacks on this side of the board, which would be slightly problematic. h3, once again, just stopping any form of an attack. Black does look as though he's trying to go all out and attack on the king side. To do that, you'd probably have to drop the bishop back or trade the bishop, then continue with g5. So g6 is what has been opted for. King over here, I don't know, that doesn't really make sense. Your rook isn't heading anywhere if you go to the h-file. But trying to create some play on this side of the board, since everything is quite locked up on this side, and white has control of the c-file. Not that you can do anything with the control of the c-file. It's frustrating when you have something that should be an advantage, but sadly there's nothing you can do about it. All right, so rook over here. This has been threatened for lots and lots of moves. I'm sure most of us by now would have either traded the bishop or just moved it out of the way. But obviously deciding that it's better, I suppose from black's perspective, you don't necessarily want to trade because the knight might be better than your bishop, especially if things do get locked up. I mean, imagine f4 and then your bishop, sure, it can go in this direction, but what is it doing over there? And you don't have any pawn breaks. And white's maybe just hanging on because, yeah, maybe you have some counterplay over here, getting your bishop in, trying to help you. Oh, because bishop over here, and you maybe have rook c7 in future. And it looks as though we might be seeing that on the board. Bishop is hopped to b6, so that's probably the reason why both were deciding to hang on to the bishops and not to trade them. It's always, chess is a battle of ideas. Sometimes you can have, you have two different players there, both of them deciding not to trade the bishops, that trading would give their opponent an advantage. So obviously some sort of a mismatch between ideas over there. Queen going to g5. You fortunately don't really have an attack. You do need to watch out though for this, that the pawn is pinned, so you can't move your knight away. Maybe get distracted and start going for knight over here, because then you do drop a pawn and suddenly black's rook is in the game. They have an attack on your king. And another thing that I'm noticing you do just have to watch out for is bishop takes h3 at some stage in future, and you can't take back because of this. Black decides it's a little bit safer to go for the trade of rooks. And this might be quite a nice move in terms of just saving time. I assume you want to pick up a6 at some stage in the future. Is white going to pick it up over here? Apparently not. Goes for trading first. Oh, then breaking open, going for a pawn break. There's another saying that the player who has a pawn break is going to win the game. And white decided to go for the pawn break over here. This is quite dangerous though. There's a bit of pressure on e1 if you don't trade. But yeah, winning the pawn over here and possibly making some progress with this. Now this is quite a big threat, because bishop takes, you can't take back with the pawn, and if you take back with the queen, then this unfortunately just loses you the queen. You have to block, and this is why white is taking a lot of time to decide. Okay. Is this... I suppose maybe you take there first, and then you take back here. Unfortunately, you have this square to escape to, because else back rank was a real possibility. And we might even see, I don't know if black is going to try push over here for an advantage, or if we're just going to go for a draw. It's another rook endgame with the saying, all rook endgames are drawn. And we'll see if this lives up to that. 17 seconds versus 23 seconds. What has happened? Has anything happened in the Grischuk versus Hikaru game? I'm sure chat knows what has happened over there. It looks as though we have had a result. Nope. Have we not? I'm scared to click on it though, because we do want to. This is also an important game, because if Dmitry is able to get a win and he has an extra queen, then he's going to be on 9.5 out of 11, just like RD forever. So then it will come down to tie breaks. Hikaru resigned. Oh no. Okay, that is not a great result for Hikaru then. So he is out of the running, even though he probably would have had a better tiebreak. So he got 8.5 out of 11, which is still, I mean, it's been a really tough field. And Dmitry gets the win. Dmitry gets the win, which means I think that we're going to have two players on 9.5 out of 11. I'm glad we stayed on this game and that we didn't go over to the Hikaru game, because this was a really important game. What a conversion as well. I was looking at the standings and missed when the queen was guards. Was that forced at all? Or was there a way to stop it? Oh, it might have been... I don't know if it was a miscalculation or a pre-move or something like that. But yeah, clearly too ambitious and then going for maybe a dirty move. Not entirely sure what happened over there. That is crazy. Let's see which games are still underway, because there will be 1 or 2 games, I'm assuming. Okay, there are a lot of games still happening. Quite one of the top games still. Jabava seems to be playing a lot of these games right down to the wire. We've caught a lot of his games after we go and see which games are still going on. And we have opposite colored bishops, the dreaded thing, or the thing that all chess players absolutely dread when they are busy winning. I was going to say, can't you just end%? But now this pawn starts running potentially. Fortunately, here we're seeing very well a good illustration of why the opposite colored bishops are problematic. It's the whole thing that black's dark squared bishop, that might have been, that was a win for Jabava? Are you sure that was not forced? Can't you let's just cheat by looking at an engine quickly. Can't you, is this winning? Okay, I was thinking you maybe still have chances to hold it, just based on the fact that the black bishop can't ever control the promotion square. And I'm assuming that black has a bit of an advantage here, because you can push this pawn and your king's close enough. And after bishop takes, how do you chase the king away though? I suppose if you've lost the pawn, the king's going to have to move eventually. So you just come across to the side of the board and your bishop is defending the square. Crazy game over there. So apparently not all opposite colored bishop endgames are drawn. There's always an exception to the rule. And we have 1 game still going on from our Titled Tuesday. It is 2 FIDE Masters. Yeah, 2 FIDE Masters. I still have the evil bar turned on. It's doing a lot of jumping. Okay, I think that was probably a draw. I'm not entirely sure what happened, and I clicked away, so we lost the pop-up of the standings. But fortunately, we can see otherwise. So it looks as though RD Forever, the Grandmaster draw at the end of the tournament, served him well, and he did have the highest tiebreak. So he walks away with our first prize this week. We have GM Dimitri with a really great win that we saw over there over, I think it was Jasper. Getting 9.5 points out of 11 as well, but sadly having the lawyer tiebreak, so getting second place, which is still very respectable in a field with such big names and such strong players. And Jabava, we managed to see that win right at the end that brought him to third place on tiebreaks, which is a very impressive result. And Grischuk coming in fourth. Quite a few upsets over there. It was hard to call. I mean, would we have predicted this as the result? We had a lot of different leaders, but no one was ever leading the field by a massive amount, and we can see that over here. I mean, our top 10 players, Hikaru coming in 10th with 8.5 out of 11th, and everyone else having 9 out of 11 or more, which is absolutely crazy. Another name that I saw at the start of the event, but we didn't manage to catch any of his games, is there in 9th place. It's GM Paramov Maxilulu, and he did really well as well, 9 out of 11. We obviously just missed seeing some of his games, but we saw most of the games from the rest of the top 10. What an event though. We saw some crazy chess, we saw some very relatable queen blunders, a lot of bishop versus pawn, or like rook pawn drawn endgames. It was really crazy, and hopefully we got to learn a bit, we got to see some exciting chess, and that's really what we want from an event like Titled Tuesday. That is it for tonight though. We will be wrapping it up, and you can move on with your evening. You can hang around for a while though to enjoy the epic music. I know that's very popular over here. Thank you very much for joining this evening. I'm your host, Rebecca Selkirk, or #chess, and hopefully I will see you in future for some more editions of Titled Tuesday. Every single Tuesday it takes place, and you can see this top level chess, same time, same place, and yeah, always the players deliver a great show, so thank you very much to them for delivering with the high quality chess. Thanks for joining, and enjoy the rest of your evening.